piracy is to be defined as any robbery committed by sea, then pirates would be nothing without their ships. How appealing is the idea of standing aboard one of these wooden behemoths, feeling the cool breeze, the ocean swelling beneath you, the rigging creaking, the dysentery growling in your guts, and syphilis itching in your crotch. What can I say, lads? Queen Anne commands and I obey. 'Tis a pirate's scurvy life for me. However, pirate ships are a bit overrated. It is often believed that he had some particular fondness of their vessels, whereas in reality, pirates were more practical. They removed all of the fanciful decorations, often exchanged or destroyed their ships when they acquired a slightly better one. Or many often didn't even sail for long periods, but went on a short cruise, grabbed some loot, and went back to spend it. Other pirates, Buccaneers specifically, often just used boats to transport them to Spanish cities, which they attacked by land. Nonetheless, some pirates were forced into a more nomadic existence, their ships becoming the wooden world upon which they lived, having to scrounge for repair materials, clothing, and food that could be foraged or looted. And indeed, there were a number of ships which were of such an exceptional quality that they could be used for extraordinary periods of time. These vessels endured all manners of hardship, ranging from wind and weather, wear and tear, musket and cannon, or sheer incompetence. And many have entered into the annals of history as legendary pirate ships. Some you may have heard of, others not. These are 5 of the most notable. Now, just like yours truly, I am sure you harbor a deep love for pirate ships, and that you have a very special one deep in your heart as your particular favorite. As a humble worshipper of my lord Algorithmus, I am subject to his whims of videos of a limited scope. I had to compile this list from a selection of both well-known and lesser-known legends that I wanted to talk about, but some had to be left out. I cannot cover all legendary pirate ships that ever existed right now. So if you feel that your particular favorite is missing on this list, worry not. Just leave a comment and I will make sure to include it in a future part 2. But if that part is to be made, I need to be certain that people will watch and enjoy it. So in order to let me and Lord Algorithmus know, you have to give the video a like, a comment, and share it with a shipmate. By subscribing and clicking the ship spell, ding ding, you'll be notified of future releases. And if you're so generous, Patreon support, channel membership, and donations help the channel along immensely. With that said, hoist the anchor, set the sails, and let us proceed on our legendary adventure. Sailing into our list on the number 5 spot, I had to include what is possibly the most infamous pirate ship of all history, Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge. She has appeared in such works as Sid Meier's Pirates, Black Sails, Assassin's Creed 4, and perhaps most famously, Pirates of the Caribbean 4 on Stranger Tides. The Queen plays a big role in the 4th installment of the Pirates anthology, and her iconic silhouette has become a go-to visualization of pirate ships, even when talking about actual history. Of course, POTC is a fantasy series in a historical setting. Pirate ships didn't have red sails and golden skull decorations, it's just there to look cool for the audience. And I certainly thought so when I was 12. Damn, heavy metal badass pirates. Bleeding angry skull flag. Show bam dash. I'm just joshing with you, pulling your leg. If you still think that a fictional queen looks good, be my guest. You're allowed to have your opinion. Now please walk the plank. Anyway, people using the QAR as a representation of historical pirate ships is highly misleading. The silhouette alone kind of resembles some vessels from the early to mid 17th century, some of which were captured and occasionally used by pirates. But by the 18th century, this sort of design would have been excluded to a few galleons. They weren't exactly a ship type as much as a designation for the Spanish treasure ships, ferrying cargo from the New World to Spain. These often weighed over 1,000 tons and were much too heavy to be of use to a pirate. The modern equivalent would be Somali pirates roaming the seas in cargo freighters. The Queen was a much smaller vessel. The Queen Anne weighed around 200 tons burthen, which is actually quite small. She is one of the smallest legendary pirate ships, and her size and armament would have been comparable to 6th rates. These were the smallest rated warships in the Royal Navy, and were used for such purposes as scouting, raiding, pirate hunting, and privateering. Now, one historian believed that the QAR was a flute, a popular merchant ship initially invented by the Dutch. One eyewitness said that the ship had a Dutch look to her, but this does not confirm that she was a flute specifically, and most eyewitnesses said that she had a French look. Indeed, the Queen was originally a French vessel named La Concorde, a full-rigged ship constructed in 1710, somewhere in France. Built as a privateer, she was mounted with 26 guns and commanded by Captain Leroux, as he used her to capture prize ships in Africa and the Caribbean. When the war came to a close, her owner, René Montouda, refitted her into a slave ship. Privateers and slavers were quite compatible, primarily since both had to be fast. Most of the guns were removed, however, except for a select few to defend against pirates. Between 1713 and 1717, she made several successful voyages in the notorious triangle between Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Her primary export was a fake cotton cloth printed by Montady in France, meant to imitate more fanciful Indian patterns. Blackbeard was able to capture La Concorde of Martinique without much resistance. Out of the initial crew of 75, 16 had perished of scurvy, and most of the others were sick, leaving only 21 to defend against a pirate company of 150, dispersed between 2 sloops. Aboard were some 455 enslaved Africans, 61 of which had perished during the crossing. Blackbeard took 157 of them, some of which he may have recruited, but most were taken to be sold. He also press-ganged a number of Frenchmen, including the surgeon, carpenter, and cook. Blackbeard must have had a taste for croissant. The French were given his old sloop, allowing them to take themselves and their remaining slaves to Martinique, similarly after helping Mr. Beard with refitting his ship. La Concorde was mounted with additional cannons and swivel guns. It is often said that she carried 40 guns, but the sources disagree, and it seems to have been between 26 to 32. Most of these were very light cannons. The heaviest were 6-pounders, which are barely even able to scratch the hull of a ship. She wasn't a battleship by any means, but would still have been larger than most vessels in the New World, and her best weapon was as a tool of intimidation, scaring Blackbeard's targets into surrendering. He didn't even have to fire a single shot. Most notably, Blackbeard renamed his flagship the Queen Anne's Revenge. This was in honor of the late Queen of England, who had reigned during the War of Spanish Succession, known as Queen Anne's War in the colonies. She was a great sponsor of privateers, allowing them to keep all of their loot instead of giving some to the government, and most of the pirates of this period had been privateers during the war. Blackbeard had most likely been one of them, and was now looking to continue this conflict in private. Furthermore, the name indicates a Jacobite leaning. After the death of Queen Anne, the throne of Britain was to be inherited by James, the next in line of the Stuart dynasty. But he was a Catholic, so Parliament elected a German dude instead. A lot of people were angry and fought back. They were called Jacobites. And since the Stuarts had historically supported privateers, pirates really liked them. The Pirate-Jacobite connection is a deep rabbit hole, and I cannot cover it further, but by aligning himself with them, Blackbeard could justify his piracy against the Spanish, French, and even English, as they were aligned with a monarch he did not recognize. Blackbeard used the Queen to go on a rampage across the Caribbean. In Mexico, she was simply known as El Gran Diablo, the Great Devil. With his fleet consisting of the Queen and 3 additional sloops, Blackbeard blockaded the city of Charleston, Carolina. He didn't dare to attack the city itself, but took as ransom a chest of medicines, presumably because his crew had been smitten with syphilis after their visit to Nassau, New Providence. From there he proceeded south, possibly aiming for the Straits of Florida. His ships were now in a desperate need of cleaning, so he took in at Beaufort Inlet. Here the Queen got stuck on a sandbar, took on water, and sank. People disagree on why the Queen Anne sank. According to the traditional narrative, Blackbeard deliberately wrecked her in order to downsize. The ship was too clumsy, hadn't really accomplished much, and by offing most of his crew, he could increase his own share of plunder. Some have questioned this narrative, saying that the Queen was a great asset to Blackbeard, and evidence points to him having attempted to save her. Nevertheless, Blackbeard certainly had to reduce his ambitions with the loss of the Queen. He sailed off in a small sloop, taking with him some of his crew and a number of slaves, most of whom were sold in North Carolina. The shipwreck of the QAR was discovered at Beaufort in 1996. Recovery has been ongoing ever since, the artifacts giving us a deeper insight not only into the life of Blackbeard, but pirates as a whole. Findings of interest include the remnants of a journal, used as wadding inside of a swivel, and a medical syringe, possibly used to treat syphilis. By sticking it up the urethra. What exactly defines a legendary pirate ship? Is it how big she was? How many guns and men she carried? What she accomplished? How long she survived? What happened to her? How she has been remembered? In some way, the legendary pirate ship must have been exceptional in some regard, to make her stand out from other pirate ships. In truth, this is a very broad category, and intentionally so, because by not limiting the criteria to ships that are just famous or were used for a long while, that allows me to talk about interesting stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. This includes those that are legendary for all of the wrong reasons. Henry Morgan's Oxford is such an example, certainly being a legend, a legendary disaster. In the early 17th century, England was continually harassed by Flemish privateers, using a swift and innovative new ship called the frigate. By the 1640s, the English had begun constructing their own frigates, and by the 50s, they were a highly desired ship in the West Indies. The name is a bit vague, but basically meant any full-rigged ship built for speed. The Oxford was one such vessel, constructed by the Royal Navy in 1656, and armed with 26 guns. 12 years later, she was sent to the Caribbean for the defense of Jamaica. The problem was that Jamaica was quite poor in 1668, having only been conquered by the English some 13 years prior. The local government just didn't have the infrastructure, men, or resources to maintain the ship. What they did have was Buccaneers. Chief among them was Admiral Henry Morgan, a close confidant of Governor Modiford himself. So the governor gifted the Oxford to Morgan, who made it his new flagship. He was currently planning a new attack on Spanish territory, and with the hull and firepower of the frigate, he would be able to assault heavily fortified Cartagena. At Port Royal, the Oxford was refitted with an additional 8 cannons and a crew of 160. The captain paused at Port Morant, where he offed his own sailing master in a dispute before escaping, forcing the governor to appoint a new captain in his stead, veteran privateer Edward Collier, and ordered to join Morgan and his fleet at Ile-à-Vache. However, Collier had additionally been ordered to arrest a French captain, Vivian, for taking provisions from an English ship, but was now sailing with Morgan. Collier asked the Frenchman to come aboard, but Vivian refused, saying it was not customary for French captains to leave their ships. So the next day, Collier went aboard a Frenchman and asked to see his commission. Vivian made several evasions, but eventually produced the commission under his name. However, he had robbed the English ship under a different name, and the robbed captain could testify that it was him. So, he and his crew were arrested. The French ship, La Cerf Volant, literally the flying deer, meaning a kite, was renamed Satisfaction, and used to ferry the Frenchmen back to Jamaica. Here they were taken to trial. Vivian was sentenced to death, but this was commuted by Governor Modiford. Collier would later take the Satisfaction on a privateering cruise to Honduras. Meanwhile, Collier had given the Oxford over to Henry Morgan. To celebrate their new acquisition, Morgan and his men gathered aboard the ship for a celebration. Whilst they were eating dinner in the cabin, the Oxford blew up. The mainmast toppled and fell upon the crew, ending several. Morgan and the officers were blown out of the cabin by the explosion, flying through the windows, into the air and the water. Debris and body parts rained around them. Rescue boats were quickly deployed by the rest of the fleet. There were 200 casualties, including multiple captains, and only 6 survivors. Among them the surgeon, 2 cabin boys, and Henry Morgan himself. He managed to survive by sitting in the middle of the table on one side. Everyone who sat on that side survived. Had he sat at the end of the other side, as customary, the history of pirates, Jamaica, and perhaps the British colonial empire might have looked very different. The big question is, what happened? According to Alexander Exquemelin, Collier had not brought Vivian back to Jamaica. He was invited for dinner by Morgan aboard the Oxford, where Morgan deceived and arrested him. Exquemelin also tried to justify Vivian's robbery of the English provisions, saying that the Frenchmen had been starving. After the ship was blown up, Morgan blamed the accident on the Frenchmen in order to exonerate himself and the drunken behavior of his men. Of course, as far as we know, the Frenchmen had already been taken to Jamaica by the time the Oxford blew up. Exquemelin says that his Satisfaction was claimed by Morgan as his replacement flagship, but we know that she was commanded by Collier on the other side of the Caribbean. The purpose of this story is apparent, to portray Morgan as more villainous, and the Jamaican colony as being equally villainous for relying on Morgan, gifting him ships, taking his plunder, and accepting his lies like this one. Instead, according to a survivor of the explosion, Dr. Richard Brown, the accident was supposedly caused by the negligence of the gunner. Flames in the powder room, etc. Who knows? It is impossible to know for certain. The loss of the Oxford had immediate consequences. 200 out of the 900-strong company had perished, and they lost a major source of firepower. Morgan's replacement was the much lighter 14-gun Lily. Most of his vessels were even lighter, so Cartagena was out of the question. A few captains were demoralized and abandoned him. So, following the advice of a French captain, he decided to attack Maracaibo. Here he deployed a fireship to blow up the Spanish pirate hunting fleet, perhaps taking a symbolic revenge for what happened to the Oxford. Pirate ships were almost exclusively stolen from the enemy and refitted into a more appropriate shape. Very few scoundrels had the opportunity to construct their own vessels from the ground up, or keel up. In 1695, William Kidd was given that honor. Kidd was a Scottish privateer who had risen into high society after siding with the government of New York in an uprising called Leisler's Rebellion. I'm sure there are a lot of Americans who say Leisler, but he was a German and they would say Leisler, so that's what I'm gonna do. Anyway, in 1695, ambition drove him to London, where he was hired by a shadowy consortium to sail as a pirate hunter to the Indian Ocean. The details of this operation were borderline criminal, as Kidd was expected not to return any of the pirates' stolen goods to the rightful owners, but give it to his employers. To make it even more juicy, the consortium included the King of England himself. This allowed him access to the shipyards of London, and Kidd set about constructing his dream vessel. He would settle on nothing more than the ultimate pirate ship type, the galley frigate. By the 1690s, the chaotic frigate of the earlier century had solidified into a more standard design. The difference was that Kidd's frigate was 6 meters longer, making her more suitable for rowing. Though she had 2 gun decks, the gun ports of the lower gun deck were pierced in between with oar ports, allowing the crew to row the ship in calm winds. As many as 34 cannons were distributed between the 2 decks, most of them 3 to 6 pounders, and a number of swivels. She was collectively owned by Kidd and his investors, but if his booty could amount to more than 100,000 pounds, it would be given to him alone as his private property. It looked like the kickstart to a long and prosperous naval career, and the ship was finished just within 5 weeks. This makes it dubious if the ship was actually built from the keel up, or an older vessel, perhaps a merchant, or maybe a galley from the Barbary Wars, refitted for a new purpose. Either way, speed came at a cost, and the workmen did a sloppy job on the hull. The crew soon discovered that the Adventure, as she was christened, had a leaking problem. The crew certainly got some sick forearm gains. Hey, you don't even have to pay for the gym. Why are you grabbing marlin spikes? Uh-oh, bucket time! Kidd crossed the Atlantic back to New York, where he bolstered his crew before sailing to Africa. From Madagascar he entered the Red Sea, his intentions uncertain. He might have intended to attack the pirates, preying on the pilgrim ships going to Mecca, or he wanted to attack the pilgrim ships. This was illegal and would have made him a pirate. The Pilgrim fleet did eventually show up, but owing to pirate activity in the recent decade, she was now protected by an East Indiaman called the Scepter. Its captain took the Adventure for a pirate, especially when she hoisted a red flag. She opened fire. Kidd did not respond. The wind died, so the Adventure pulled out her sweeps and rowed. The Scepter pursued, towed behind by 2 rowboats. When the Adventure closed on one of the Pilgrims, they opened fire also. The Adventure was forced back, and though she shadowed the Pilgrims for a spell, eventually retreated. Proceeding to India, Kidd managed to get on the bad side of the Portuguese, so much so that they sent out 2 men-of-war to deal with him, armed with 40 and 20 guns respectively. Kidd was taken on water when he received the report, and ordered his crew to hoist anchor. Most men would have cut the cable, but he kept a cool head. He intended to escape to the south, but unpredictable winds cast him off course, and the next morning, the Portuguese were almost within gunshot. Owing to the light winds, Kidd could have pulled out the oars and escaped, but decided instead to deploy a ruse. He allowed the Portuguese to get close, allowing them to chase him. The Portuguese became overconfident, and the smaller ship went ahead of the larger one, much farther ahead. Around noon, Kidd revealed his hand. He tacked, suddenly came about, gaining the weather gauge and the upper hand over his pursuer. Then the wind died, trapping the pursuer and preventing the larger ship from reinforcing. Now, the Adventure pulled out her sweeps. She was constantly able to outmaneuver the Portuguese, all the while blasting her with her superior armament. After 7 hours, Kidd had lost 11 men, but beaten his opponent into submission. The men wanted to plunder her, but as the wind picked up and the bigger ship closed in, Kidd decided to escape. Never a modest man, he commented, "I believe no Portuguese will ever attack the king's colors again, in that part of the world especially." The engagement was textbook, and the Wheel of Fortune seemed to finally be turning for Kidd and his adventure galley. She captured a pair of French prizes, most prominently being the Queda Merchant. Now, this is going to get a bit big-brained. The Queda was a Mughal Indian ship owned by Armenian merchants, but carrying French passports. So in the eyes of the law back then, Kidd was allowed to capture her. England and France were at war. And what a capture she was. The ship and all of the treasure aboard was enough to reimburse the investors many times over. Kidd would become a rich man, and he'd be allowed to keep the Adventure as promised. Of course, neither the Armenians nor the Mughals would accept this. They'd caused a lot of diplomatic ruckus in England, and coupled with the many enemies Kidd had made, he really wasn't a pleasant person. He was made a scapegoat of all of England's problems, imprisoned, and hanged. Some people to this day search for his hidden treasure, but its location was revealed by the man who hid it and confiscated by the government. No one knows what happened to the Queda. Some believe that she is the shipwreck found off Catalina Island in the Dominican Republic. As for the Adventure, she was basically falling apart at this point from hard seas and multiple engagements. Worms had devoured the hull, which Kidd had wrapped with a thick cable to literally hold her together. 7 Hindus were forced to do the pumping. The Adventure entered St. Mary on Madagascar, a notorious pirate port where Kidd encountered an old rival, Robert Culliford. Kidd was hoping to top off his now successful career by bringing Culliford in chains back to London. But, having pissed off his mutinous crew, he had previously ended one of them with a bucket. Most of them deserted over to Culliford's side. He was besieged inside of his quarters, where he and the cabin boy fortified themselves with dozens of muskets and pistols. The crew, hoping to take his commission, decided to just burn a couple of boats instead, and buggered off. Culliford and his crew eventually departed, allowing Kidd and his skeleton company to beach the Adventure and burn her. She was beyond saving at that point, but the ironwork was retrieved from the ashes and used in repairing the Queda. He made her sails from silk and loaded up what treasure he still had, taking her across the Atlantic. On paper, the Adventure could have been the best pirate ship of all time. Emphasis on could. A sloppy job on the hull, and boom, she ended up a pile of ashes on the Isle of Madagascar. For all of his faults, it can't really be put on Kidd, and he did handle her quite well, doing the best with what he got. Captain Kidd got the chance to build his own pirate ship, flopped and failed. Most pirates never had access to the shipyards of London, but they might settle for something more simple. Some just constructed canoes or even barks out of wreckage. But on the island of Bermuda, many of the landholders were ship's masters, merchants, as often as smugglers and privateers, and they would use their estates to construct their own vessels. These estates included black slaves that were often employed as woodworkers, blacksmiths, and shipwrights. Their favorite vessel to construct was the Bermuda sloop, best distinguished by its raked mast. The Amity may have been such a vessel, presumably hailing from the island of Bermuda, and constructed at her latest in 1691. During this year, she was commanded by Captain Richard Gilbert, operating out of Barbados. The next year, she was back in Bermuda, co-owned by Gilbert and 3 other investors. They agreed to sell a share of the ship and grant captaincy of her to Thomas Tew, a Rhode Islander who used the Amity to buy a commission, licensing him to attack French possessions in Gambia. The Amity sailed alongside a brigantine named Amy, but crossing the Atlantic was no easy feat, especially for ships of this size that were best suited for coastal activities. The Amity was a 70-ton sloop, carrying 8 guns and a company of 46 men, most of them veteran buccaneers. There is some dispute on how the Amity was rigged, however. In the 18th century, Bermuda sloops were narrowly defined as single-masted and rigged with 2 headsails, a gaff, and a top. But sloop riggings were much more fluid in the 17th century. Some believe that the Amity was single-masted, but others think she was ship-rigged and had 3 masts. We know that she did not have 2 masts at this point, because she was later refitted into a brigantine, a ship type with only 2 masts. Either way, she was a small ship, the smallest ship on our list by far, weighing less than half of the second smallest, the Queen Anne's Revenge. So making the Atlantic voyage would have been terrifying. However, Bermuda sloops were known for their excellent seagoing qualities, and would later be exported en masse to Spain and Portugal. Yet, after a few days of sailing, the Amy sprang its mast in a storm, and the two vessels were separated. The crew now started to get cold feet, being uncertain if they could actually continue their attack on the slave forts of Gambia. Two proposed a radical new idea. They would sail even farther, past Gambia, crossing all of Africa, and going to the Red Sea, where they would capture a wealthy pilgrim ship. This would make them flat-out pirates, and liable to hang. However, few had actual qualms about it in the period. Pirates often saw their activities as fluid, believing privateering to be any robbery done against an enemy, including enemies you weren't actually at active war with, such as national enemies or even the religious kind. Islam was viewed as the great antagonist of Christianity, even as a greater threat than Catholic Spain. So a lot of pirates, even regular people in the colonies, believed that attacking pilgrim ships in India and the Red Sea was justified, partly because many of their sailors had been captured, enslaved, and ransomed by the Barbary corsairs. But this is the moral equivalent of, I don't know, Americans bombing Malaysia for what happened in 2001. According to the official narrative, two only decided to change course after being separated from the Amy. But it is also likely that this had been part of the plan from the beginning. The commission to attack the French was just a ruse, a justification. Going pirate without telling its investors would have been very, very dangerous. But there is a reason to believe that two duped them. I'll get into it later. Either way, the Amity was able to make this incredibly long and dangerous voyage without incident, remarkable for a vessel of her size, and truly making her worthy of legendary status. They finally ended up in the Red Sea, where after weeks of fruitless searching, finally stumbled upon a merchant convoy owned by none other than the Great Mogul of India. The Amity fell upon the flagship of the fleet, commanded by 300 troops, almost 10 times the crew of the Amity, and subdued them with a single volley of muskets, not sustaining a single casualty. The ship was plundered and let go. Every man had earned a share of 1,200 pounds, a fortune in those days, but Tu himself claimed 8,000. He was now a rich man. They made a quick stop at the slender island of St. Mary, the pirate base just off the coast of Madagascar. Here they careened the Amity, cleaned and repaired her, and bought provisions and materials from the Malagasy and the merchant who ran the colony, Adam Baldridge. On the 23rd of December, they left St. Mary for the long trek home, having left Bermuda on the 8th of January. Instead of returning to Bermuda, as per his commission, Tu decided instead to take in at his home of Rhode Island. According to a letter sent by him to his investors, this was because a storm had damaged the Amity's mainmast. This is never mentioned elsewhere, so was most likely doctored by Tu. Still, the investors didn't complain, Tu paying them 14 times their investment. Never mind where it actually came from. This is what I meant about him possibly duping them. Tu wanted to find a place to spend his loot. Neither Rhode Island nor Boston were especially compliant, but he was warmly received in New York, where he befriended the local governor. He described Captain Tu as a very pleasant fellow, but nonetheless hoped to cure him of his habit of swearing. In 1694, the governor sold him a commission, again to privateer against the French, though both Tu and the governor had different intentions. The Amity had no issues finding recruits. News of this voyage made servants run away from their masters, sons from their parents. There were even young boys who crept aboard as stowaways. After rounding the Cape of Good Hope and entering the Red Sea, Tu joined up with a pirate fleet headed by Henry Every and his own legendary pirate ship, the Fancy. Their intention was to take the Pilgrim fleet. They waited for weeks at the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, but eventually realized that the fleet had slipped past them. The chase was on. However, the Fancy, being a full-rigged 4th or 5th rate built in London, was able to sail far ahead of the smaller vessels. The Amity was left behind, and no one is entirely certain what happened to her. At some point in the pursuit, 2 was decommissioned by a direct hit from an Indian cannonball. The Amity, now without a captain, split away from the fleet and returned to St. Mary. Baldridge gave them the whereabouts of a merchant ship he had traded with, the Charming Mary, and the bitter Amities set off to take her. The Mary was captured, seemingly without a fight, the pirates taking her as their new flagship, and giving the Amity to Captain Glover, commander of the merchants. After this, the pirates selected Bobbington as their new captain, and set off to avenge Thomas Tew. According to Baldridge, they were captured by the Mughals. Unfortunate. Glover, now the new commander of the Amity, took her back to America on her 4th Atlantic crossing. Being based in Barbados, he had her refitted there and loaded with all manners of products. Notably, the owners of the Charming Mary had her refitted from a sloop into a brigantine, changing her into a 2-masted vessel. If she had previously been a full-rigged sloop, this would have made her easier to handle, especially for a smaller crew. Either way, he or the owners clearly didn't get the hint the first time, and decided to return to Madagascar for a second mercantile voyage. Trust Adam Baldridge once, shame on him. Trust Adam Baldridge twice, yeah. When the Amity lay anchored at Madagascar, she was attacked by Dirk Shivers, a German pirate whose own ship had been damaged in the monsoon. He stole her water casks, sails, rigging and masts, wrecking the plundered hull on a reef. Captain Glover said he'd forgive Shivers for his piracy if he let them return to America. But Shivers said he'd only do so if the merchants would join him on his pirate venture. They had no choice. The Amity met with an unfortunate fate, to no fault but the men who commanded her. This small and unseemly vessel was able to make 5 Atlantic crossings without sustaining any significant damage, a feat which was sometimes difficult for bigger ships. In the hands of a skilled captain and crew, she was clearly able to take on vessels many times her own size and make an incredible fortune. 2 only seems to have died because of bad luck. What are the chances of getting hit by a cannonball? All in all, the Amity is definitely the first vessel on this list to actually deserve the stamp of legendary. The rest are kinda pushovers. That is, before the final entry. In 1671, Henry Morgan led the largest pirate army ever assembled and attacked the city of Panama, even though the Spanish and English were at peace. He managed to win the day, but the denizens set fire to their own homes to prevent Morgan from taking any plunder. The rest of the treasures were loaded onto mules and carried overland to the Pacific coast, where it was stowed aboard a 400-ton ship, La Santísima Trinidad, the Blessed Trinity. These treasures included decorations from the local churches, making her survival paramount to the religious Spaniards. Regardless, the Trinity was in no proper state. She was armed only with 7 guns and 10 muskets, nor was she fully rigged, mounted only with her mainsails. Referred to by Exquemelin as a galleon, she certainly might have been built galleon style, with a high aftercastle, galleries, and fine decorations. Basil Ringrose called her as high as any third-rate ship in England. Morgan immediately sent out a gang to capture her. The first attempt acquired a bark and managed to capture several boats, but the galleon slipped away. The second attempt managed to seize the ship's boat, bound ashore to fetch water. The galleon just within the pirates' grasp, but they'd rather spend the evening drinking, allowing her to slip away again, and permanently. The Trinity had escaped. For now. Fast forward 8 years later. Morgan was now Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica and was passing anti-piracy laws, often hanging his old associates. but some of them had troubles with laying down their arms, and with the Caribbean growing dangerous, decided to depart to a different sea. Assembling at Morant, a fleet of small vessels led by John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, and Richard Sawkins sailed across the Caribbean Sea to Darien. Here they befriended the Kuna people, allying with them in their efforts against the Spanish. They crossed the isthmus and entered the Pacific Ocean in their canoes. Here they were met by 3 Spanish barks, which they defeated in a brutal sea engagement. Having defeated this small armada, the Buccaneers proceeded to Perico and then to Panama Harbor. Here they encountered a ship undoubtedly familiar to the veterans of Panama 8 years prior, La Santísima Trinidad. They boarded and conquered the vessel, sustaining a few casualties. In total, the various fights and skirmishes in the region had lost them about 40 men, with 50 wounded. These were brought aboard the Trinity, refashioned into a hospital ship by the pirates. She carried no cannons at this point, but had a decent amount of loot, including gold, iron, soap, and candy. Yummy. Wait, what's carries? The Spanish captain of the Trinity was named Peralta, the one who had saved her during Morgan's attack. He was kept as a prisoner for several months, becoming somewhat close to a few of the Buccaneers. He talked about comets with Bartholomew Sharp, an illustration of which was provided in his journal. The pirates removed him from his office, electing Richard Sawkins in his stead, owing to his excellent performance in the battle against the barks. Sawkins was a bit of a hot head, and it didn't even deflate when he took an arrow to it, and survived. It probably exacerbated his problem, and a month or so later he was offed, when his aggression isolated him and got him cornered by the Spanish. Sharp took over as the new captain. His first move was to improve the Trinity's sailing qualities by modifying her. He cut down the roundhouse coach and all of the carved works, gilded decorations. These modifications were praised by Nicolas Moreno, said to be the best pilot in the South Sea, and a captive of the pirates. With the Trinity at the head of a small pirate fleet, they continued ravaging down the coast, taking ships and burning settlements. After burning the town of La Serena, a native swam out to the Trinity on an inflated horsehide, filled with combustible materials. He secured it to the ship's rudder and set it on fire. The pirates inside were almost choked by the smoke, but they managed to stop the fire and arrest the saboteur. Sharp was eventually deposed by John Watling, who died shortly thereafter upon his disastrous attempt at capturing Arica. Sharp was reinstated, but much of the company deserted him. With only his loyalists remaining, Sharp spent the remainder of the voyage capturing various prizes at sea. For this purpose, he decided to refit the Trinity a second time. They visited a Spanish shipyard, hiring or kidnapping several of the carpenters. With the help of these men, they lowered the deck of the ship, cutting her almost to the waterline, and making her flush from stem to stern. Having once been a tall, palace-like ship, she must now have been near unrecognizable, being almost flat. The masts were likewise shortened to make her easier to handle. When all of this was done, the prisoners were released. Since the Trinity carried no cannons, the pirates had to rely on her superior speed. They used it to close in on their target, and pepper them with musket fire until they surrendered. Their most notable engagement was against the Santo Rosario. The Spanish fired first, the Trinity closed in, and the Buccaneers ended the captain and all of the officers in a single musket volley. The Rosario surrendered. Aboard of her, the pirates found 700 bars of some weird, grey, useless metal. They thought it was tin and decided to keep a few to make bullets. More notable was a Waggonier, a big book full of charts and maps of the Spanish Pacific. This region had barely been visited by Englishmen, let alone charted, and was highly valuable. The Buccaneers would later offer this book to King Charles II, winning them their pardons, much to the protestations of the Spanish ambassador. The maps would then be copied in the books published by the Buccaneers, even if they claimed to have drawn many of the maps themselves. Who knows? They didn't fully realize the value of the Waggonier at the time, but they soon realized that the 700 bars of tin weren't actually tin. It was silver. The scalawags had spent the last 2 years or so hunting for that one big score, risking their lives many times over, and here it had just slipped by them, thanks to incompetence. In the end, this voyage was completely fruitless, but one hell of an adventure. After failing to take the town of Paita, the Buccaneers decided enough was enough and planned on heading home. Crossing the Straits of Magellan was a cold, stormy and dangerous task. A slave boy succumbed to frostbite. They also shot and ate a penguin, because that's the stuff pirates do. They eat anything. Oh look, here's something yummy on the floor. Wait, why is it moving? They never found the Straits of Magellan, the storms forcing them ever southward. They had to round Cape Horn, a dangerous task, and Sharp is said to be the first Englishman to do so from the east. Not even Francis Drake had done it. The voyage was quite remarkable, and truly attests to the quality of the Blessed Trinity. Within 4 months, they had sailed from Coquimbo to the Caribbean. Henry Morgan expressed his amazement over this in a letter, even though he convicted and hanged one of the crewmen. They wanted to sail the Trinity to Petit Goave, the Caribbean's most notable pirate stronghold, and where the Buccaneers had received their commissions to sail against the Spanish. But at this point, the Trinity was so leaky as to make it dangerous. Instead, they were warmly welcomed at St. Thomas, a Danish colony often recognized as a pirate free port. The governor, Nicholas Esmith, was the brother of a retired pirate. The Trinity was allowed berth under the very castle of the island. However, her damaged cables split and she ran ashore. The crew had been reduced to 7 Buccaneers, who could not afford to hire the slaves to pump her, so they had to beach the vessel. In February of 1682, the Trinity had finally ended her long and epic voyage. Still, she would remain useful. Buccaneers would use her as a sort of depot when careening their ships. By August 10, 1683, Nicholas had been ousted by his pirate brother, who was now housing a notorious French pirate, John Hamelin. Hamelin is one of the cruelest scoundrels of the period, and one of the few pirates to openly call himself a pirate. Commanding La Trompeuse, the trickster, Captain Charles Carlyle of the HMS Francis managed to track him to St. Thomas. As soon as the Francis closed in, she was fired upon not only by La Trompeuse, but to Francis' dismay, the fort also. He sent ashore a messenger, demanding to know why the Danish defended a known pirate, but received no satisfactory answer. Carlyle would have to improvise. He and his men prepared fireworks, incendiary and explosive weapons, the likes of storm pots and fire arrows, which they used in a night attack to set fire to La Trompeuse. In the darkness, this must have been spectacular and terrifying. La Trompeuse caught fire, the flames spreading to the magazine, where she exploded. One piece of burning timber flew and landed aboard the Trinity, which caught fire likewise, and was burned to ashes. It was truly an epic end for one of the most epic ships of the Pirate Age, even if she had no hand in the engagement herself, and even if she had never truly seized any great bounty. Still, her story is one of the most unpredictable and adventurous from the Golden Age. Having escaped Morgan at Panama, been captured and remodified by the Buccaneers, carried them down the coast, rounding the continent, and then meeting a dramatic end in the harbor of St. Thomas. Truly worthy of legendary status. With the burning demise of the Blessed Trinity, my hearts, our leaky ship sails into the sunset. Even though I'll have to fix these holes somehow, preferably with your generous donations. This does not mean the end. If you enjoyed this video and want to see a follow-up, please tell me in the comments, and also what legendary pirate ships you want to see next. I have a pretty broad list, and if this potential series proves popular, I'd be glad to expand it. I'd also be curious to know which one of these entries you enjoy the most. Until then. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.